Eoghan Corry, editor of Air and Travel magazine, is on the line. Good morning, Eoghan.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, Venice, everyone, it's sort of see Venice and die because it is such a unique place. And with that accolade, I suppose, come a lot of its problems.
A lot of its problems, smelly, overpriced, and overcrowded, but it's still one of the most amazing cities in the world, and it's one of the places you have to really go and see at least once. That's its problem. There are all sorts of wannabe Venices all through Europe. It gets close to about pre-pandemic. It was getting about 6 million international visitors a year. It's not as big, not as much as Paris. Paris, London would be closer to the 20 million. But the size of Venice and the fragility of Venice's atmosphere is the problem. And I think Hugo mentioned the cruise ships. That's probably the first step in reducing the threat from the number of visits is to keep the cruise ships out. I see a little bit of a trend towards that internationally, Pat. Amsterdam recently voted on something similar.
Now, it doesn't mean that people on cruise ships can not visit the cities. Do they just come in on tenders then, in smaller numbers? Is that what happens?
There are two things here. The sheer volume of cruise ships nowadays, some of those, the larger Royal Caribbean ships, Oasis, Allure class, they would have 5,300 passengers plus the crew of about 2,000. So what we've seen is the number of cities that people visit or these ships can get into has decreased as the ships get bigger, and you can actually flood a city with passengers. People in Dublin will remember pre-pandemic one July day when we had 7,000 crew. We had 4 cruise ships in town and 7,000 people coming through town, all trying to queue it for the Book of Kells or the same queue. So it does. It just lands an awful lot of people for a very short number of hours into a city. Amsterdam have decided not to take ships into the cruise port, but as you say, what will happen is the cruise ships will probably transfer to Haarlem, about 2 hours away, and still bring the passengers in. The problem with Venice is its sheer the romance of it and its success. And from the UNESCO point of view, we already saw we had Dubrovnik on the UNESCO heritage site. It's gone. We've seen some other places that people go to in large numbers being taken off the heritage list. It doesn't really make a hell of a lot of difference to the number of people who want to visit the city. But what it does is it removes one of the oversights of the management of tourism in the city. And that's probably the biggest risk out of this story.
Now, the idea of day trippers being charged, in other words, if you fly into one of the airports and then locate yourself not on the island of Venice but elsewhere and then take a day trip, the idea then that they would charge the day trippers, 10, 15 euro just to access the place.
That's exactly it. If you've got a theme park, if you've got an attraction with a admission price, if you've got a strategy for coach tours like the Cliffs of Moher would have introduced a couple of years ago, you can actually manage the number of people coming in. With an open city where there is commerce going on, you can't manage the number of people who are in the city at any given time. So what has been proposed in quite a few places is this congestion charge. You charge the day tripper to get in, and you charge for you work out ways of doing that. The technology for footfall and stuff like that is really, really great now. So you can actually tell the number of people who are in a city at a given time. And while nobody really wants to eliminate tourism, what they do want is to move the numbers to the margins, to the out of season and out of times of the day when things peak. That tends to happen itself anyway, Pat. Tourists don't like to go to places that are very, very crowded. I'm reminded of the great Yogi Bear quote, Yogi Berra quote, where he said, nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded. Tourists like to avoid big long queues and crowded days, but one of the ways that's been mooted for doing that is the equivalent of a congestion charge for day trippers to a city.
Now, that's a great quote. And nobody goes there. It's too crowded. Wonderful. The Italians themselves are destroying Venice, says Kevin. When we were there, the place was crawling with tourists to the extent that there was no pleasure. The same thing is happening in Mykonos and in Santorini, the two of the Greek islands, and it's all down to greed. So says Kevin. But the Greek islands have developed dramatically since my student days when I travelled and slept on beaches on the Greek islands. You don't do that anymore. But what to do for a population who depend on tourists for any kind of a sustainable income? Because in Greece, as you know, there's a gravitation towards Athens, off the islands and off the hinterland, and the cities get more and more congested. And you'll reach a point, I suppose, like some of the islands off our coast, where it's just unsustainable to live there 12 months of the year.
Pretty much. I mean, the UNESCO, there's a big query about UNESCO. It's sort of a rush towards the UNESCO sites in the 80s and 90s. I've always found it fascinating. We only have two of them in Ireland. One of them is one of those islands you allude to, Skellig Micheál, with no residents and very fragile. And the other was Brú na Bóinne, which also had to, in the 90s, curtail the number of people going into the real tomb in Newgrange because of its fragility and the damage that was being done. That's what we've been seeing. We've been seeing, an example would be the French, what the French have done with their more fragile prehistoric paintings. They've recreated exact replicas. A new one opened in Marseille of a sea cave which was inaccessible except to divers. So what we're seeing is people building virtual copies of what would be fragile parts of the world. And I am reminded by somebody who told me that he didn't really like Venice, but he loved going to the Venice resort in Las Vegas, which was much cleaner. And the guy steering the gondola would sing, an Italian love song, O Solo Mio, or something like that. So there is an element, there is a cartel or a group of tourists who are happy to put up with what looks like the real thing and is a lot more accessible. If you can't make it, fake it.
Yeah, that's Stonehenge too. Anyway, Eoghan, thank you very much for joining us. Eoghan Corry, who's editor of Air and Travel magazine.